Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. I'm the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. This is the weekly update. Today is Thursday, September 25th, 2025. We're now at 720 days since October 7th, almost at the 2-year mark since the atrocities of that day. And 2 years of ongoing bombing, the challenges and devastation that the people of Gaza are experiencing. Lots of updates from the last week, so I will jump right in. Someone said to me yesterday, how can you tell these stories every day? How can you just even reading the news, let alone reflecting about it day after day after day? And you know, I confess that sometimes when I'm doing the daily updates, I feel like I just get rote. I just say the news. And yet, you know, kind of going through the motions. But my hope and prayer is that as we tell these stories and recite, you know, summaries of some of the main things that are happening, that our minds, our hearts, our spirits, our souls, that we do this to give witness to what's happening, that we do this as a spiritual practice as well. And that sometimes when we feel like our hearts can't take the news that we hear, that we would just ask God to carry it because it's not too big for God. The Palestinian death toll this past week surpassed 65,000 people. 65,000 people is believed to be a vast underestimate. You heard that 2 weeks ago, the former head of the Israeli military confirmed that more than 200,000 people have either been killed or had casualties in Gaza over the last almost 2 years. The ground invasion of Gaza City is in full swing. Hundreds of thousands of people have stayed, about half the population evacuated. Many of them found the conditions in the humanitarian camps in the south of Gaza so abhorrent that rather than stay there, they decided to risk bombing, the ground invasion, the military attacks, the starvation that's experienced in North Gaza, and to return home because the crowded tent cities were considered just unlivable with inadequate sewage or lack of sanitation facilities, limited food, you know, very little humanitarian assistance. It makes me think of a note I received a few months ago from a dear friend who leads a development agency in Gaza, who said that the daily indignities are the worst part. There's no privacy. He said there's nothing sacred. He said you go to the bathroom in front of others. You can't clean yourself adequately, if at all. He said the constant dehumanization is one of the things that's taking the greatest toll. Al Jazeera reported yesterday on Wednesday that the Israeli ground invasion in a 24-hour period of time, and including bombings in other parts of Gaza, killed at least 85 people. 12 Palestinians, among them 7 women and 2 children, were killed in a strike on a stadium that was sheltering displaced families in the Nuseirat refugee camp. We've heard the name of that camp a lot over the past 2 years. Israel has pressed on with relentless attacks despite calls for a ceasefire from world leaders as the UN General Assembly has been meeting. We'll talk about that more in a bit. The Ali Stadium was converted into a refuge for Palestinians who were fleeing the onslaught, and that was the site of another massacre yesterday. The official death toll 65,419 Palestinians, with 167,160 people being wounded. And we know that the death toll the day before was 73 people in attacks since midnight. 20 Palestinians, including children, were reportedly killed in a different building as a result of an IDF strike. Israeli tanks have moved into multiple neighborhoods throughout Gaza City. There's geo-located images that show this. Journalists working for CNN reported that there's heavy shelling, drone presence, explosions, and sounds of gunfire throughout Gaza City. The Al-Shifa hospital, also located there, was one of the last functioning hospitals. It's overwhelmed with casualties from the strikes in recent days. Hospital staff are operating on severely wounded patients in filthy conditions and with minimal to hardly no anesthesia. Tuesday, it was announced that the Israeli offensive on Gaza City has taken the hospitals in that city out of service. Jordanian armed forces moved their field hospital that was there in the Tel Al-Hawa neighborhood to Khan Yunis in the south because they could not ensure the safety of hospital staff. On Tuesday, news said that Israeli artillery, shelling, and quadcopter drone attacks are driving people from their homes in Gaza City. If you don't know what a quadcopter is, this is not a technical definition, but I've been on the Gaza border and I've heard them. They are militarized helicopters. Or drones in this case, quadcopter drones. And so they are militarized drones that are unmanned. On Sunday, Israeli forces blew up a residential building that killed an additional 40 Palestinians and prompted many others to flee. On Monday, the death toll in 24 hours was 61 Gazans. The IDF said on that day that it killed 15 Hamas militants in Gaza on Sunday. One of the things we hear a lot in international news reports is not the question of whether or not Hamas exists, but when there are reports from the Israeli military, often the international news says unsubstantiated. So what does it take to be constituted by the Israeli military as a Hamas militant? Hamas authorities also publicly executed 3 men who were accused of collaborating with Israel on Sunday. The Israeli Defense Forces said that more than 500,000 people have evacuated from Gaza City. That's about half of the city's population. And the IDF said that representatives from the United Nations reported that Hamas fired on a UN UNICEF team that were attempting to open a new corridor for aid trucks from the Kerem Shalom crossing into the south of Gaza. Late last week, it was reported that no food had entered the north of Gaza in roughly a week. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UNICEF, said that the Israeli military had closed the Zakim crossing. That was one of the main crossings that was taking or allowing food to enter into the north of the Gaza Strip. According to the UN office, there are grave concerns over fuel and food stock depletion. Separately, the Israeli military said that their management of Gaza via COGAT, that there were 230 aid trucks going into Gaza on Tuesday. So my point of this part of the update is that the UN said no trucks had entered in a week. COGAT said 230 trucks had entered in one day. And so COGAT declined to explain the discrepancy between their account and the UN account. One of the things that we've seen happen is it could be that the trucks were allowed inside the Gaza enclave. They're reported as entering Gaza, but then they're not allowed to be distributed. So that could be a part of the discrepancy. The destruction in Gaza could be turned into a real estate bonanza. That's a direct quote from the Israeli finance minister Smotrich. He said late last week that he has started negotiations with the Americans because Israel paid a lot of money in this war. So we're going to divide how to make a percentage, i.e. profit, on the land marketing later in Gaza. One of the things we're seeing is that there's this political conversation about a Riviera and land and what's going to happen and real estate deals, such as what Smotrich is referring to. And you'll hear now I'm going to shift and talk about ceasefire negotiations, where there's these other conversations that are more the mechanics of what's Gaza going to look like. And they totally contradict one another. So for example, post-war Gaza, Egypt has already started preparing police forces. One of the things in several of the deals has been the idea that there would be a force to police the Gaza enclave that would be from Arab states. And so Cairo is training Palestinian police forces. The idea in some of these ceasefire agreements, none of which have passed, of course, has been that there would be a force of Arab states and the Palestinians that would make sure that Hamas, or militants don't have control or access. There's been significant conversation about this week. Egyptian Foreign Minister Abdel Hadi said that the plan includes training 10,000 Palestinian police officers. Half would be trained in Egypt and Jordan. The other half would be trained by the Palestinian Authority in their own institutions. Monday, we heard that Hamas had drafted a personal letter to President Trump saying that they would release half of the hostages in exchange for a 60-day ceasefire agreement. Fox News reported that the letter was given to the Qataris and was supposed to be delivered to Trump this week. In the OPT, the UN Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territories reported on Tuesday that the Israeli government has shown clear intent to establish permanent control over Gaza and to annex the entire West Bank. Also significantly this week, on Friday, Israel shut the land crossing between the occupied West Bank and Jordan until further notice. There was an attack the day before where a driver bringing humanitarian aid from Jordan that was supposed to go to Gaza opened fire and 2 Israeli military personnel were killed. On Monday, it was reported by Jordan that the border would be opened, but Israel said that they did not open it. And then yesterday, it was reported that Israel is going to indefinitely close the only crossing between the West Bank and Jordan at the direction of political leadership. And I just want to tell you, Father Richard Sewell, who's one of our main partners of the Church of England, he's based in Jerusalem. He said this, he said that retribution by Israel for the recognition of Palestine has begun. The closing of the Allenby Bridge indefinitely, while Palestinians with Israeli citizenship and in Jerusalem have status and other options to leave the country, Palestinians in the West Bank now are completely trapped. They don't have permits to go into Israel and they are not allowed to leave. There's no way to leave while that Allenby crossing is closed. He said they are penned in by an occupying power, unable to exit for any reason, however urgent or vital. West Bankers who are out of the country are stranded and cannot return home. This is an absolute breach of human rights and should bear serious consequences. Imprisoning 2.5 million people is reprehensible. We must hope that pressure forces this closure to be brief. Also in the West Bank, I wanted to let you know, an activist who we've worked closely with over the years, who formerly was with Rabbis for Human Rights, Rabbi Eric Asherman, was detained by the police. He was standing in solidarity with Palestinians, called the Israeli police to intervene against settlers, and he was the one who was arrested. This was in a village where a Palestinian was fatally shot in August. I gave details about that footage. You know, Asherman said to the police officers, "Aren't you arresting them?" referring to the settlers. "Do you believe the settlers and not me?" The policeman replied on the video, "Yes, yes." And then Asherman was arrested for incitement, false and unfounded calls, and provoking and distorting reality. The Israeli army announced that 3 Palestinians who were suspected of manufacturing rockets were arrested. The IDF also announced more than 75 Palestinians had been arrested throughout the West Bank over this past week. Also, the 6 actors and militants who were a part of that attack in Jerusalem where 6 people were killed, their homes will be demolished. That was announced. The IDF also raided Berzeit in the West Bank. The UK warned Israel to not annex the West Bank in retaliation for the UK recognizing a Palestinian state. Also, a woman who was a former member of the Israeli Knesset for 10 years, an Israeli citizen, Palestinian Hanin Zoabi, was arrested for incitement. I wanted to be sure to let you know that. I mean, she is a diplomat, she's an Israeli citizen, and she was arrested because of giving a pro-Palestinian speech in Vienna in 2024. Moving on to Israel proper, there was a Houthi strike that hit the south of Israel in Eilat. 22 people were injured. No people were killed. There have been protests that became a prayer during Rosh Hashanah in front of Netanyahu's home. Netanyahu has asked the Trump administration to pressure Egypt because Egypt has had a military buildup in the Sinai because of grave concerns that the 2 million people in Gaza will be displaced there. And Qatar wants an apology from Israel for its strike on Doha before it resumes mediation talks. In Lebanon, there was a strike on the south by the Israeli military that killed 5 people. Of those 5 people, 3 of them were children. Hezbollah chief has said, this is Naim Qassem, said that Israel is the enemy, not Hezbollah. He's calling on Saudi Arabia to turn a new page and to stand alongside of Hezbollah. He gave a speech about that this week. And in Syria, speaking of speeches, the Syrian president gave his first speech at the United Nations, calling for an end to all sanctions. This was the first time Syria's head of state has spoken at the UN in 60 years, roughly. The U.S. Special Envoy to Syria, Tom Barak, said this week that Syria and Israel are very close to reaching a de-escalation deal. That has been significant in the news. On October 5th, Syrian electoral colleges selected by regional committees. They're going to elect 2/3 of the assembly, the People's Assembly. This is a 210-member assembly in the governance of Syria. 2/3 will be elected by these regional committees, and 1/3 will be selected by President al-Shara in Syria. Related to Yemen, a press freedom group said this week that Israel killed 31 journalists in one strike on Yemen that happened this week. Lots of conversations about Iran. Iran has started to rebuild the missile sites that were hit by Israel during that 12-day war in June. The State Department this past week barred Iranian diplomats who came to the UN General Assembly from shopping at wholesale stores like Costco, and they also banned them from purchasing luxury goods without specific permission. That was an action of the Trump administration. The UN Security Council decided on Friday to implement snapback sanctions on Iran. This relates to previous agreements, and those will come into effect on the 27th of September this year. Iranian President Pezeshkian vowed that Iran will overcome any reimposition of sanctions. That was his response. And Netanyahu ministers during Rosh Hashanah, a prayer event, vowed to destroy the Iranian axis in the new Jewish year. This was a toast at a general staff forum, at the IDF headquarters. It was attended by Defense Minister Katz in Israel and the Chief of Staff of the military, Ayil Zamir. Several international updates. The UN General Assembly has been meeting this week. There's been a lot of talk and rhetoric calling for an end to the atrocities in Gaza. Palestinian President Abbas spoke on a video. He's said to speak again today. France led the way on Monday. President Macron opened the UN conference in New York, advocating for a two-state solution and Palestinian statehood, calling for a release to the 48 hostages, an end to the war, an end to the massacre and displacements. Nothing justifies the continued war in Gaza, he said. We must pave the way for peace. We must do everything within our power to preserve the possibility of a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, side by side. So most significantly, France, the UK, Canada, Australia, and Portugal announced they now formally recognize a Palestinian state. Some might say this is just symbolic. Others, when I talked to President Abbas, when I had a meeting with him over the past year, he said this is so significant because it allows Palestine to act within the international bodies, not just as observers. So France acknowledged statehood. Andorra, Belgium, Luxembourg, Malta, and Monaco also announced or confirmed recognition. This was a part of the France-Saudi Arabia conference that was just before the UN General Assembly. Turkish President Erdogan called on Israel and said, a people once victimized by the Holocaust, Israel now commits genocide against his neighbors. Erdogan, of course, is of Turkey. Also, Spain's King Felipe VI made reference to Jewish history and called on Israel to follow international law in Gaza as they've committed abhorrent acts, killing countless civilians, bombing hospitals, and calling for no more death. So this was the 80th UN General Assembly. The Senegal president also condemned the war in Gaza, which he said has become hell for thousands of souls. I wanted to be sure to mention also at the UN, one of the Israeli women who was taken captive as a hostage in Gaza, she was one of the spotters who survived Gaza captivity, talked about what it was like being held in Gaza. She said, I was afraid for my life at every moment. There were unbearable sanitary conditions, constant fear that every moment would be my last. I suffered severe malnutrition, indescribable hunger, and untreated injuries. I was moved from hiding place one to another. There were periods of time when I was completely alone, secluded from human interaction. In other instances, I was with other young women, some of whom were wounded severely and left untreated. That was Naomi Levy, the former hostage who was taken captive on October 7th. There are roughly 48 hostages that remain in Gaza. It's believed only about 20 of them may still be alive. We, of course, are calling for their release. Organizers of the Gaza-bound Samud flotilla, we've talked about that, were attacked again by Israeli drones and flash bombs. They are protesting Israel's siege on Gaza, seeking to sail to the territory, carrying symbolic humanitarian aid. They said their communications were jammed. You could hear explosions from different boats. They suggested that Israel could be behind the attack, and the Italian military responded and sent a naval vessel to assist the Gaza-bound Samud flotilla following that drone attack. Also, pro-Palestinian strikes on Monday by grassroots unions caused major disruptions across Italy, particularly in Milan, storming the central station there and clashing violently with the police. The Hind Rajab Foundation, if you don't recall, Hind Rajab was the 6-year-old child that was killed and surrounded by her family who had died in a car in North Gaza last year. That foundation filed a criminal complaint in Athens against an Israeli soldier, accusing him of war crimes and genocide. Just a couple more updates. In terms of the US, they are threatening on sanctioning the entire International Criminal Court, which could have significant repercussions. And Axios reported this week that Trump was present on Tuesday, or he would present on Tuesday. This is last week, this is this week. I know what week it is. This is Tuesday, just a few days ago, that Trump would present a plan to several Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, Indonesia, and Pakistan, that Trump would present a plan to end the war in Gaza. The Arab leaders said that they thought Trump wanted to get their feedback and support on a plan to end the war. Tuesday, it was reported that that meeting occurred. I've not heard a specific readout about it, but the U.S. wants Arab and Muslim countries to agree to send military forces to Gaza to enable Israel to be able to withdraw and to secure Arab and Muslim funding to support the transition and rebuilding. This past week was Rosh Hashanah. Yesterday it ended. It started on Monday, the new year in Judaism. This is the first of the high holy days as specified in Leviticus chapter 23. It describes the Feast of Trumpets, instructing the Israelites to observe the day, a sacred assembly, a memorial that's marked by trumpet blasts, prohibiting regular work, requiring a food offering to God. Many Jewish believers around the world celebrated Rosh Hashanah. Many said the holiday was a difficult one, marked by ongoing war, a persistent wave of anti-Semitism, and unresolved national divisions within Israel and divisions within the Jewish community globally. Christian updates. Gaza City residents who have been at the churches have decided to remain. I shared significantly stories from some of those Christian families, such as Ramez Sori, who decided not to go to the south, but instead to remain in the church. He and hundreds of fellow Christians were among the more than 500,000 Palestinians that decided to stay. Sori said that he was fearful of the fighting, but couldn't think of any other place to take his elderly parents. His 87-year-old father cannot move without assistance. He worried about finding food and water in the tent encampments in the south. It wasn't that he thought the church would be safe. Sori lost 3 of his children when the airstrike hit the St. Porphyrius Church on October 19th, 2023. He was sheltering there with his family in the early days of the war. He said it's just that it is the least bad alternative. We will remain in the church, but the church is not a safe place like people imagine. I say this because my own children were killed before my very eyes. There is no protection. There is no safety. We know there is no safety. I'll close with a word about the Church of the Crossroads conference that happened last weekend and before in the Chicago area. 800 or so people. The event was sold out, gathered together. Reverend Dr. Munter Itzhak, many Palestinian Christians were there. Bethlehem Bible College wrote about the event this week, saying it's not just a conference, it's a movement. And the people who gathered left with marching orders. We invite you to stand with us, read and endorse the declaration that came out of the Church at the Crossroads conference. It, as of last night, had 2,431 signatures. The declaration ends this way. We invite you, fellow Christians in America and beyond, sign this statement as a declaration of allegiance to the crucified and risen Christ, who calls us to love our neighbor, to seek justice, to walk humbly with God. To sign is to say that the gospel cannot coexist with dehumanization. We will no longer ignore the cries of our Palestinian siblings. We will no longer excuse violence with scripture. Signing this declaration is not the end, but a beginning, a step towards listening deeply, remembering the gospel, living more faithfully. If you sense the Spirit stirring, we invite you to join us in pursuit of justice and peace in Palestine and in Israel. Let us be a part of the church's repentance and renewal. Let us stand with those who are suffering, and let us follow Christ more fully. May it be so. Amen.